Appendix on the amphiboly of the concepts of reflection through the confusion of the empirical use of the understanding with the transcendental. That is Kant's pretty long title of this appendix that he appends at the end of the analytic. In this amphiboly, as the piece is generally known, and amphiboly means something like ambiguity or uncertainty or a confusion because of certain modes of expression. So there's a certain confusion or ambiguity here, which has to do with the concepts of reflection. Okay, Kant hasn't told us what the concepts of reflection are, but he is going to do so very soon. The point of the amphiboly is mostly to explain what is wrong with the most influential philosophy of Kant's own time and place, which is the philosophy of Leibniz, especially as it was taken up by Christian Wolff. So Kant is going to take quite some time here to explain how Leibniz, well, how basically all of Leibniz's core ideas rest on the same misunderstanding. And of course it is a misunderstanding that could only be cleared up, according to Kant, once his own transcendental philosophy was developed, because it is only his own transcendental philosophy that explains to us the difference between the empirical use of the understanding and the transcendental use of the understanding, and thereby solves or resolves this amphiboly, this ambiguity. Okay, so what is reflection and what are the concepts of reflection? Here is how Kant starts the amphiboly. Reflection does not have to do with objects themselves in order to acquire concepts directly from them, but is rather the state of mind in which we first prepare ourselves to find out the subjective conditions under which we can arrive at concepts. It is the consciousness of the relation of given representations to our various sources of cognition. So what we are doing in reflection is we are thinking about our representations themselves, sort of bracketing the questions of like bracketing any real relation to actual objects. We're going to compare concepts and we're going to try to find out how they relate to our various sources of cognition, such as sensibility and the understanding. So here is what Kant says a little bit further on at halfway at A261. The action through which I make the comparison of representations in general with the cognitive power in which they are situated, and through which I distinguish whether they are to be compared to one another as belonging to the pure understanding or to pure intuition, I call transcendental reflection. And of course, transcendental reflection is in a large part what we have been doing, right? This is precisely what we have been trying to understand. We've been trying to understand how the concepts relate to the different sources of our cognition. The relation, however, in which the concepts in a state of mind can belong to each other are those of... So now Kant is going to introduce some new concepts which we need when we are comparing concepts with each other, right? So forget about objects for a moment. Once we compare concepts with each other, these are the concepts that we need. So these are sort of meta concepts having to do with thinking about concepts, right? With comparing concepts with each other. And they are concepts of identity and difference, agreement and opposition, the inner and the outer, and the determinable and the determination, or matter and form, as Kant also says. Now, all of these concepts could be used in three different ways. And the difference between these three different ways is sort of the core message of the amphiboly. So first of all, we can use them in a sort of purely logical sense, right? Identity and difference. Well, I can take two concepts and check out whether it's the same concept or whether they are different concepts. Nothing wrong with that, as long as we realize that we are talking merely about concepts, right? And that this has nothing to do with objects. Now, all of these relations could also be applied to our representations of objects, right? And in thinking about the objects themselves. So I can wonder whether two things are the same, well, whether they are really two things, whether A and B, if those are names of things or point at things, whether it's the same thing or whether these are two different things, right? That makes sense. So to take this really famous example used all the time in 20th and 21st century analytic philosophy, it used to be the case that people often saw a sort of bright star appear in the heavens in the morning, and they called it the morning star, and they saw a kind of bright star appear in the heavens in the evening, and they called it the evening star. And now, of course, we can wonder whether the morning star and the evening star are the same thing, right? They're clearly not the same concept. Like the morning star appears in the morning, right? And the evening star appears in the evening, but are they the same thing? Is it the same identical thing, or are they different things? And it turns out that they are the same thing. It's Venus in both cases, the planet of Venus. So that is very different, right? It's one thing to ask about identity of concepts. It's another thing to ask about identity of objects. And of course, when we ask about identity of objects, given everything that we've learned about objects, Kant believes that we ought to understand by that concepts of objects of sensibility. Right, objects of possible experience. So that's the second use. We can use these things about objects of possible experience. And of course the third use, which is transcendent, or as Kant again generally says here, transcendental, is applying it to noumena, right? Noumena in the positive sense, things that are given to us in the intellect, in intellectual intuition. So we could of course ask about two things that were given to us in intellectual intuition, so without sensibility playing any role, whether they are the same or whether they are different. Except, of course, that we can't, because nothing is given to us in intellectual intuition. We do not have intellectual intuition. Okay, so what goes wrong? Where does the amphiboly or confusion come from? Well, the amphiboly or confusion comes from not having the critical system, so not understanding that we can only get in touch with objects if we think of them as objects as given in sensibility, objects of possible experience, and so believing that we can find something out about objects, about the things in themselves really, by taking these concepts of reflection, such as identity and difference, in some merely logical way, independent of sensibility, right? That my non-sensible grasp of identity and difference tells me something about the real objects. That is the problem that Kant is going to discuss, and that is the problem, the confusion, which he thinks engenders all of Leibniz's philosophy, or at least sort of the core commitments of Leibniz's philosophy. So let's see how this works in practice, and let's use identity and difference as our example. And so now we come to A263 or B319, the heading 1, identity and difference. So here is what Kant tells us. If an object is presented to us several times, but always with the same inner determinations, then it is always exactly the same if it counts as an object of pure understanding. Not many, but only one thing. So if an object is presented to us several times, but always with the same inner determinations, then it is always exactly the same if it counts as an object of pure understanding. So if I'm thinking of an object as an object of pure understanding, and if I think it and it's presented to me, and there's no inner difference, right? It's just the same. If I think the object itself, it's the same thought. Then my conclusion ought to be, Kant agrees and affirms with somebody like Leibniz, that it's the same thing. And this is precisely, Kant would say, what happens when we compare concepts, right? Concepts are, they sort of have only these inner determinations. They have their meaning. They're not in space and time being like related through causation or whatever. And so, like, if I think the concept and I think the concept again, it's the same concept, right? And we don't say, oh, but you thought them at different times, so it's got to be a different concept, right? That's not the way it works. But that is only possible because this is an object of the pure understanding. But if it is appearance, Kant goes on to say, then the issue is not the comparison of concepts, but rather, however identical everything may be in regard to that, in regard to concepts, the difference of the places of these appearance at the same time is still an adequate ground for the numerical difference of the object of the senses itself. So, when it comes to sensibility, objects of sensibility, if I have an object A and an object B, and in terms of concepts they're precisely the same, but they are at different places at the same time, then they are different objects. Right? Then they can't be the same object, they have to be different objects. They are different objects. That is what grounds, that is a sufficient ground for their difference. Their being at different places at the same time. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because Kant tells us this is precisely where Leibniz went wrong. So, here's what Kant goes on to say. Thus, in the case of two drops of water, one can completely abstract from all inner difference of quality and quantity, and it is enough that they be intuited in different places at the same time in order for them to be held to be numerically different. So if I have two drops of water, and they are the same in every respect, like really totally identical, totally the same, right? Even their minutest particles are the same and in the same configuration and with the same speeds and so on and so forth. But these two drops of water are at different places. Okay, they are numerically distinct. They are not the same thing. Leibniz took the appearances for things in themselves, thus for intelligibilia, that is, objects of the pure understanding, and there his principle of non-discernibility could surely not be disputed. But since they are objects of sensibility, and the understanding with regard to them is not of pure but of empirical use, multiplicity and numerical difference are already given by space itself as the condition of outer appearances. So what is Leibniz doing here? Well, Leibniz rejects the possibility of the scenario that Kant just presented to us. Leibniz famously tells us that it is impossible for there to be two drops of water that are exactly alike in all respects, except for being at different places. Because in a sense they would have to be the same object, but they can't be the same object. There would be a contradiction. In fact, a contradiction, it would contradict the principle of sufficient reason for Leibniz. If there were two objects that are exactly the same in the universe, there can't be two objects that are exactly the same, because there would be no reason why they weren't switched. Kant doesn't really talk about that, but he does clearly think that Leibniz is wrong in claiming to know a priori that there will never be two of the same drops of water or two of the same leaves or whatever anywhere in the universe. And the problem for Kant is that Leibniz was thinking purely about the concept of the object, about its internal properties. But we have to think about the object as this spatiotemporal thing, right? This object of sensibility, which means that one of the essential elements of the object is its place in space. And so there is a difference between these two drops of water, which is that they are in different places in space. And so Kant thinks that Leibniz's whole story, really here, about indistinguishability, falls down as soon as you give sensibility its proper place. As soon as you realize that the objects are essentially the objects that we talk about, think about, the objects that populate the world are essentially objects of sensibility. And so their spatial location, like, belongs to them. That is one of the properties they have, one of the things that individuates them. Okay, so that is where we can see that Leibniz makes this mistake that Kant has called the amphiboly, right? The mistake of taking these concepts of reflection, like identity and difference, and assuming that we can use them in a purely logical way, so without thinking about sensibility, and then believe that whatever conclusions you draw from their logical use tells you something about the things as they are in themselves. right? So now we know something about the things in themselves. There can't be two things with the same internal properties anywhere in the universe. Not true, says Kant. This confusion comes from taking a purely logical use of these concepts as having an objective use, as describing things in themselves, and forgetting that sensibility is always the necessary context in which any thought about objects can take place. So Kant does the same thing for his other four pairs of objects of reflection: agreement and opposition, inner and outer, matter and form. And then he comes to the remark to the amphiboly of the concept of reflections, and there he more systematically explains to us what went wrong in Leibniz's account. So the basics we have already heard, but let's look especially at what Kant is going to say at A270 and A271. Here's what he says about Leibniz. He compared all things with each other solely through concepts, and found naturally no other differences than those through which the understanding distinguishes its pure concepts from each other. The conditions of sensible intuition, which bring with them their own distinctions, he did not regard as original, for sensibility was only a confused kind of representation for him, and not a special source of representations. So Kant points out that Leibniz makes this mistake, because he starts out from a mistaken conception of sensibility. For Leibniz, sensibility is in a sense a kind of confusion. It's a sort of bad version of the intellect, right? When we really think something, that's when we grasp it as it really is. In sensibility, we get a sort of confused grasp of it. Sometimes maybe, we don't have a full intellectual grasp of the world, of course. God has. But sensibility for Leibniz is something derivative and non-ideal, and it's not its own source of cognition. So that is where Leibniz goes wrong. And then Leibniz, Kant says in this famous phrase, in a word, Leibniz intellectualized the appearances, just as Locke totally sensitivized the concepts of understanding in accordance with his system of noogeny, basically the coming into being of mind, I would say. So here Kant is very explicitly putting himself in this tradition of the empiricists and the rationalists. And he says the problem with a rationalist like Leibniz is that he thinks that sensibility is merely a kind of intellect, right? A kind of bad intellect. He intellectualizes the appearances. Whereas Locke, on the other hand, thinks of the intellect as something that is secondary to sensation, to sensibility. And so, instead of seeking two entirely different sources of representation in the understanding and the sensibility, which could judge about things with objective validity only in conjunction, and this of course is Kant's own starting point, each of these great men holds on only to one of them, which in his opinion is immediately related to things in themselves, while the other does nothing but confuse or order the representations of the first. Confuse in the case of Leibniz, order in the case of Locke. So really what Kant is doing here is he is saying that empiricism and rationalism, right, in making one of these sources of cognition like the only source of cognition, thereby fail to put themselves on the path to transcendental idealism. They commit themselves to the transcendental realism, which claims that we are immediately in touch with things in themselves, and all the problems of these philosophies follow from that. And of course, Locke's philosophy is going to have different problems from Leibniz's philosophy, but the problems are going to be there nonetheless. So what Kant does next is he takes one by one, basically in the order of the concepts of reflection that he has given us, these core ideas of Leibniz's philosophy, and shows how they follow from the confusion that he has identified. I'm not gonna go through that in any detail. If you are familiar with Leibniz's philosophy, with his ideas about monads, for instance, of predetermined harmony, his relational theory of space and time, then I think all of this will make sense to you. And if you don't, then we would have to give a lecture on Leibniz, and that's really not what I'm doing here. So I do want to say a little bit about what happens at starting about halfway at A276, B332, and what happens there. What happens there is that Kant sort of once again reflects on things in themselves and the limits of our knowledge. And I think these pages are quite fascinating because they, at least the way I read them, you see Kant a little bit sort of vacillating, or is it vacillating? Well, wavering between two different stances, two different metaphilosophical stances that play a very important role in how we read Kant. And the two stances that I'm thinking of are the stance where you say, well, things like when we talk about the thing in itself and the noumenon in the negative sense and the transcendental object and so on and so forth, we need that in transcendental reflection. And we sort of need that to put a boundary to the understanding, a boundary to where knowledge can be had. But what we're not really doing is positing something beyond that, about which we would like to know more. But alas, we can't do that. In a sense, there's just nothing there. Right? We don't have a grasp of anything that we cannot grasp. So that's the first stance. The first stance is where you say, we don't really have a grasp of anything that we cannot grasp. Right? Whatever lies outside of the bounds of knowledge, the understanding can say something about it, something that is helpful in not making the mistake of trying to go beyond the bounds. But at the same time, it's clear that we don't have a grasp of anything that lies beyond the bounds, and so we can't desire knowledge about that or believe that we are sort of limited because we can't have knowledge of what is there. That would be one stance. And the other stance would be saying, oh no, there is all this stuff that we would really like to know something about, but we can't have that knowledge, right? We are unfortunately these very limited beings. So the question is whether the realm of the transcendental, whether that is in a sense empty, it's an empty thought that merely serves a philosophical purpose in keeping our theorizing within its proper place, or whether we should think about the realm of the transcendental as something that we would love to explore, but unfortunately we have this terrible kind of cognition, this well, certainly suboptimal kind of cognition. I have in previous lectures I think shown my sympathy with the first of these readings, right? The kind of more radical reading, I would say, in which Kant says, look, we're drawing this boundary, but there's not really anything outside the boundary. Definitely, we couldn't grasp that there is something outside the boundary, and so there's nothing to worry about, right? We are not limited in a bad sense. Okay, so I think what is interesting about this passage is that it's sort of it fits both readings, right? So one of the things that Kant says is this: what the things may be in themselves I do not know, and also do not need to know, since a thing can never come before me except in appearance. I also do not need to know, right? It's sort of dismissive, right? I mean, the thing in itself, whatever. So that really sort of fits this first stance. On the other hand, like a little bit later on, this is at A278, Kant is going to say, observation and analysis of the appearances penetrate into what is inner in nature, and one cannot know how far this will go in time. This is sort of empirical research. Those transcendental questions, however, that go beyond nature, we will never be able to answer, even if all of nature is revealed to us, since it is never given to us to observe our own mind with any other intuition than that of our inner sense. And then he goes on to say that to be able to use such an unsuitable tool of investigation to find out anything except always more appearances even though we would gladly investigate their nonsensible cause. And that sort of seems to fit this second reading much better. And so maybe, and this is just a suggestion, but maybe what is going on here, or the right way to think about this, is to think of Kant as kind of in an amphibole himself, sort of sometimes falling on one side, sometimes on the other side of this divide. And maybe this being a structural ambiguity of the critique, which wouldn't be that strange, because this is really totally new metaphilosophical territory that Kant is occupying. So, some more stuff about Leibniz. And maybe what is interesting about this latter half of the Amphiboly, or one of the things that's interesting about this latter half of the Amphiboly, is Kant's insistence that the appearances, and he has said this before, but he is really insisting on it here, that the appearances consist only of relations. Right? They consist only of relations. It's like they don't have an inner nature. They only have relations, right? Relations to each other, like relations of cause and effect, and of course relations to us, right? As knowers, we are sort of related to them in all kinds of ways. For instance, in perception, and our grasp of any appearance is totally exhausted by our grasp of relations, the relations that it is, and it doesn't have sort of its own essential, intrinsic nature. That is very important for some interpreters' ideas of what Kant is doing and how he sets up his project. It certainly points forward to a lot of metaphysical discussions that philosophers nowadays and in the past several decades would have been having. Like I'm thinking about things like structural realism, for instance, which, but also I guess in continental philosophy, things like structuralism and sort of this broad group of thinkers who would fall under post-structuralism. A lot of people there who like the idea of an ontology that's based only on relations. So this is really sort of a forward-looking element in Kant that is going to be taken up by later philosophers in all kinds of different ways. Okay, final thing. Like, how does Kant end the analytic? This doesn't really have to do with the Amphiboly at all, but, I'm also not going to make a separate video about these 1.5 page, where Kant, kind of just for fun, says, oh, by the way, let's take the table of categories once more and apply it to the concept of nothing. Right? And we get 4 kinds of nothing, or 4 ways of thinking about sort of the negative. Like the empty concept without an object, right? When we have a concept and we don't know whether there's anything that does or maybe even could be described by that concept, right? Could fall under that concept. That would be the empty concept without an object. Like non-sensible intuition, right? We don't know whether anything falls under the idea of the concept of a creature with non-sensible intuition. No idea. So that would be an empty concept without an object. You could also have an empty object without a concept. Well, but we can sort of think about an empty object without a concept. That would be something like a square circle, right? I mean that there's no concept there. As a concept, it doesn't make any sense. So when I'm talking about a square circle and whether it exists or something like that, I'm talking about this empty object without a concept, which is somehow, we could say it's even more nothing than the empty concept without an object, right? I'm not sure Kant would say that, but we could say that. So one sees, Kant said, that the thought entity, number 1, is distinguished from the non-entity, number 4, by the fact that the former may not be counted among the possibilities because it is a mere invention, although not self-contradictory, whereas the latter is opposed to possibility because even its concept cancels itself out. Even, yeah, maybe Kant does think that it's more nothing, that the 4 is even less than the 1. Both, however, are empty concepts. There are also sort of positive concept that we can use, which are the concept number 2 and the concept number 3, the nihil privativum and the ens imaginarium. They are empty data for concepts. So the nihil privativum, Kant's example is darkness. Right? How can you think darkness? Well, you can only think darkness as the absence of light. Right? If you didn't have the empirical, if light had not been given to us empirically, then we couldn't have the concept of darkness, even though darkness is the absence of light. Right? And silence, the concept of silence is the absence of sound. But we couldn't have that concept if we didn't have, if we didn't empirically have sound, right? So that's actually a nice point to make. If we think of empty space, right, we tend to think of it as something that is dark and silent, maybe. Well, we're really, in a sense, just negating our own sensory modalities, which would mean that a different creature with different sensory modalities would have this thought of nothing in a very different way, right, as the negation of those sensory modalities. And then empty intuition without an object, that is the mere form of intuition. That is sort of just when you think empty space and empty time, right? As space and time, as Kant calls it, the ens imaginarium, because that is sort of the field in which the imagination can play. Okay, so I mean, not terribly important for the critique as a whole, but I think it's a nice little passage. This passage about the nothing. Thereby we arrive at the end of the analytic. And if you are with me, have been through all of these things with me, all of these videos, that's great, but don't abandon me, because even though the analytic might be more famous than the dialectic is still plenty famous and contains lots and lots of really interesting things, including Kant's theory of reason, without which his critical system just isn't complete. So I hope to see you again when we go on into the transcendental dialectic.